Greetings, friends. We've arrived at Ecclesiastes chapter 3. Today's reflection is based on verse 1 to verse 11. I'm going to share only 2 points. I'm going to read these verses and then I'm going to share the 2 points that I would like for us to reflect on in these verses. There is an occasion for everything and a time for every activity under heaven. A time to give birth and a time to die. A time to plant and a time to uproot. A time to kill and a time to heal. A time to tear down and a time to build. A time to weep and a time to laugh. A time to mourn and a time to dance. A time to throw stones and a time to gather stones. A time to embrace and a time to avoid embracing. A time to search and a time to count as lost. A time to keep and a time to throw away. A time to tear and a time to sue. A time to be silent and a time to speak. A time to love and a time to hate. A time for war and a time for peace. Before I move on to the other 3 verses, what scripture is presenting here is that we experience all these things in our lives. It does not mean that God has predestined these moments for us in our lives. It's that through the decisions we make and the decision of people around us or of society, we find ourselves at times experiencing all these things. So it's not that God has predestined us for a time to kill and a time to heal, a time to tear down and a time to build. No. But the way we make our choices and society in general, we find ourselves in these situations at times. Let me go on to verse 9. What does the worker gain from his struggles? Verse 10. I have seen the task that God has given people to keep them occupied. Verse 11, which is the last one. He has made everything appropriate in its time. Remember, we were talking about a time for this, a time for that. In verse 11, Solomon says he has made everything appropriate in its time. He has also put eternity in their hearts. But man cannot discover the work God has done from beginning to end. Well, in verse 11, Solomon tells us that, in verse 10, he says, I have seen the task that God has given people to keep them occupied. Now, this task he mentions in verse 11, which is that God has put eternity in our hearts. That's what should keep us occupied. And then he says, but man cannot discover the work God has done from beginning to end. And so the work that has been given to us is to contemplate on God and to contemplate on the things that God has done from beginning to end. But Solomon says we cannot exhaust that. So it is something that we will continue to do for eternity. Now, what I try to understand verse 11 in light of from verse 1 to verse 7, where he speaks, there's a time for this, there's a time for that, there's a time for that. And what I see for myself is the following. All these periods where he says there's a time for this, and there's a time for that, and there's a time for this, all these things come to an end. So a time for this comes to an end, and then there's a time for this. And then there's a time for this that comes to an end, and then there's a time for this. So these things have an expiring date. All these occasions that happen under the sun. But in verse 11, Solomon presents something that doesn't pass. He presents something that is continual. He presents an experience that is not only for a restricted period, that as we experience all these things, all these periods, there is something that is constant. Verse 11. Okay, let me read verse 10 again. He says, I have seen the task that God has given people to keep them occupied. He has made everything appropriate in its time. He has also put eternity. The Hebrew word there is olam. Olam is an extended period of time. It could mean forever, it could mean eternity, but it's an extended period of time without end. He has made everything appropriate in its time. He has also put eternity in their hearts. But man cannot discover the work God has done from the beginning to end. And so Solomon suggests to us that the best work, the best thing we can do is to reflect on God and the things that God has done. They are so sweet, they are so deep, they are so amazing that we cannot exhaust them. We go through certain periods that come to an end, but this experience of searching for God, knowing God, and discovering the things He has done from beginning to end, this has no end, and it's an exciting thing for us to do. I hope that this reflection has been a blessing, and I hope that you've learned something as I have, and that we know what is the task that God has given for us in which to keep us occupied. May God bless you, and I will see you next time.